Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR journey into the history of the corset. If you've listened to any of my previous history talks, you'll know that I like to pick slightly quirky subjects that shine a light on the past from a different angle. And I think the corset does that rather well. On the one hand, it's simply an item of clothing, but on the other hand, it has some rather fascinating social and cultural connotations that make it an interesting reflection of how society has changed through the centuries. So, in this exploration, we're going to discover the origins of the corset. We'll examine some different styles from different centuries. And we'll take a look at how this fairly practical undergarment has evolved as both a piece of clothing and a social symbol on its journey through history. As usual, there'll be some images to accompany our talk on the video slideshow, but there's no need for you to look at these if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the history of the corset. The origins of this intriguing garment are somewhat lost in time, because for many centuries corsets were primarily pieces of functional underwear, which means they were thrown away once they'd worn out, and they didn't tend to be preserved for posterity. Consequently, not many actual historic examples of corsetry have survived before the tail end of the 16th century, and all that we can speculate about earlier uses of the corset come to us via visual records in art. However, even these records are somewhat misleading, because they tend to pertain not specifically to corsets, but to bodices, and bodices are structurally very similar to corsets. They're made in the same way, from panels of stiffened fabric that are tied together with lacing in order to pull in the body. But they're also different in that they were designed to be worn as outer garments, whereas corsets were created as undergarments. It's the undercover nature of the corset that makes it hard to know just how long humans have been wearing them. But by tracing back the origins of the bodice, we can perhaps find some evidence of how corsets might have originally developed too. One of the earliest appearances of a bodice-type garment is in a set of ancient Minoan snake goddesses. These figurines date from about 1600 BC, and each one appears to be wearing a very tight bodice-like girdle that cinches in the waist. The discovery of these figurines in a 1903 archaeological excavation helped to confirm the hypothesis that humans had probably been using garments to restrict and alter their body shape since the very earliest civilizations. However, to be perfectly honest, the snake goddess girdles look more like very wide, stiffened belts, rather than true bodices or corsets. And to find an example in art that truly resembles what we think of today as a corset, we need to jump forward in time quite significantly to 15th century France, and to a painting entitled "The Madonna Surrounded by Seraphim and Cherubim" by the artist Jean Fouquet. Fouquet created this work in the early 1450s, and it shows the Virgin Mary breastfeeding the baby Jesus. This was a fairly conventional topic for Christian art at the time, but the way in which Fouquet has depicted his subject isn't conventional at all, and neither was the model who posed for the figure of Mary. She was a woman called Agnès Sorel, and she was the mistress of the then French king, Charles VII. Sorel was known for her deliberately provocative publicity stunts, which she used both to scandalise the French court and also to maintain the king's interest in her. One of her most audacious acts was to attend court with the top of her bodice unlaced, so that her breasts were openly on display. Some French courtiers were absolutely shocked by this action, but others copied Sorel, and she'd soon started a fashion for unlaced bodices. Fouquet capitalised on Sorel's daring and fashionable act of exposure by having her pose for his painting of Mary with her bodice unlaced, and the resulting artwork is remarkable for its strikingly modern look. It also provides us with an intriguing glimpse into the forerunner of the corset, because the bodice that Sorel is wearing is extremely form-fitting. It's moulded tightly to her body, and it's laced, or rather unlaced, up the front. As such, it looks uncannily like a modern-day corset, and by deliberately leaving the laces undone to reveal what lay beneath, Sorel was perhaps one of the first public figures to openly recognise the erotic potential of the garment, and also to innovate fashion by blurring the lines between outerwear and underwear. 100 years later, in the mid-16th century, we find an early written account of corsetry, which comes from the wardrobe accounts of Mary I, who was Queen of England in the 1550s. The record includes item for making 1 pair of bodies of crimson satin, item for making 2 pairs of bodies for petticoats of crimson satin, item for making a pair of bodies for a farthingale of crimson grosgrain. What this record makes clear is that by the 1550s, the garment we know today as the corset was known as a pair of bodies. The term corset did actually exist during this era, but it referred to a very different item of clothing, a long gown that was tightly laced and which had its origins in medieval France. By contrast, the term a pair of bodies refers to an item of clothing that was made by lacing together 2 separate bodies or panels of form-fitting stiffened fabric, and this is of course the item which is known today as a corset. The term bodice has its origin in the phrase a pair of bodies, but the ones that were ordered for Queen Mary don't seem to have actually been bodices. They're definitely classed as underwear rather than outerwear because they're listed alongside orders for matching petticoats. Mary's crimson satin corsets might perhaps have looked similar to the earliest physical example we have of a pair of bodies, which belonged to Eleanor de Medici, the Duchess of Florence, and which date from 1562. These were found on the Duchess's body when her grave was disinterred during the 19th century, and although her pair of bodies were, by that time, rather faded and soiled, it's clear that they too were originally made out of crimson silk. By contrast, Mary's successor to the English throne, Elizabeth I, seems to have favoured a far plainer type of undergarment. A surviving corset from her era is known as the effigy corset because it was used to dress an effigy of Elizabeth that accompanied her funeral procession in 1603. Rather than being made from sumptuous crimson silk, her pair of bodies have been created from pale green fustian, which is a blend of simple cotton and linen. And her corset is also interesting for another reason, because it's been stiffened with Baleen. Baleen is the cartilage found in the mouth of a whale, and it was a very popular early stiffening agent for corsets because it was both strong and resilient, but it was also flexible, which made it more comfortable to wear. It was, however, a very expensive and rare material, so only the wealthiest ladies could afford Baleen stiffened corsets, or whalebone corsets as they would later become known. And further down the social scale, women had to make do with stiffening their corsets with dried reeds, strips of animal horn, or even thin strips of wood. However, another early example of a Baleen stiffened pair of bodies that we still have today belonged to Dorothea von Neuburg, a German countess, who was buried in an ivory satin corset laced with silk ribbons. Again, we only have this item because Dorothea's body was exhumed, which is something the Victorians seem to be quite keen on doing. But her disinterment did lead to the discovery of this other early corset, and it has an interesting design because even though the original Baleen stiffening has disintegrated with the passing of the centuries, you can still see the rows of closely spaced vertical pockets that were sewn into the panels of the corsets to hold the Baleen strips. It's interesting to compare Dorothea von Neuburg's corset with Elizabeth I's effigy corset because they're quite different in style. Dorothea's pair of bodies is shorter. Its waist length fastened at the back, and it features separate unboned cups for the breasts. And this would have created a fairly natural, albeit enhanced, silhouette. By contrast, Elizabeth's corset is very long in the body, and the boning runs vertically all the way down it, from top to bottom. This means that when it was laced up, the corset would have effectively flattened down the breasts and elongated the waist to create a very long, cylindrical body shape. To a modern viewer, this might seem like an odd way to contour the body, but if we look at paintings from the era, we can see that this elongated cylinder or inverted cone-shaped silhouette was really fashionable during the Elizabethan period. It appears in countless portraits of the Queen herself, and also in many other paintings of Elizabethan noblewomen, who are shown sporting that same elongated shape. It's also during the Elizabethan era that we encounter an early reference to a corset in a work of literature. In the comedy Antonio and Mellida, which was written by the satirical playwright John Marston around the year 1600, one of the characters is encouraged to make his behaviour as straight in outward semblance as a lady's busk. A busk is the name for the wider strip of rigid boning that was inserted into the front of the corset in order to provide a firm structure for the fastenings or lace holes. And there's another reference to one in a slightly later work, Elegy 19 by the poet John Donne, which is entitled To His Mistress Going to Bed. This is an erotic and humorous love poem which contains the following quartet of lines. Unlace yourself, for that harmonious chime tells me from you that now it is bedtime. Off with that happy busk, which I envy, that still can be and still can stand so nigh. The term busk is actually still used today to denote the front fastening of a corset. However, by the end of the 17th century, the rather unwieldy phrase, a pair of bodies, had been replaced with the far pithier term, stays. The word stays originates from the French verb étayer, which means to prop up or support. And as ideals of feminine beauty changed with the times, the idea of a corset that propped up the body, and more specifically propped up the breasts, became increasingly fashionable. By the Restoration era, we find that corsets are still fairly conical in shape, but they're also far less elongated than their Tudor predecessors, and they're cut much lower at the front to create a high, round cleavage. This somewhat sexier silhouette is completely in keeping with the more free and easy culture of the Restoration period. In 1660, the Stuart king, Charles II, had been restored to the throne after nearly a decade of puritanical Commonwealth rule that had been marked by both sexual and social repression. With the restoration of the monarchy came a backlash against puritanical values. Theatres and public houses were reopened, women were allowed to perform on stage for the very first time, and at court, libertine values were not only tolerated, but became actively fashionable. Women, and in particular women's sexuality, was suddenly far more central to both court life and cultural life, and the new upfront cut of their corsets was perhaps a sly reflection of this societal shift in attitudes. Along with it came a more open recognition of the corset as an object of desire. In his 1714 poem Araminta, the writer John Gay makes a reference to a corset as "the rich stays her taper shape confine," and the relish with which he conjures this image leaves the reader in no doubt as to its erotic potential. At the same time, corsets were beginning to become far more decorative. Theoretically, they were still classed as undergarments and weren't supposed to be seen, but in practice they were becoming more glamorous. Opulent damask, figured silk, and intricate embroidery were all favoured as corsetry decorations. And consequently, if you visit the costume collections of museums such as the V&A in London or the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you'll find some rather gorgeous examples of 18th century stays that were definitely designed to be looked at as well as worn. Nevertheless, for many women, stays were still viewed primarily as a functional undergarment, and specifically as an essential training tool that was necessary for creating the correct fashionable posture. In her 1778 novel, The Sylph, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who was herself a leader of fashion, sums up the contemporary attitude to stays through a letter that her fictional heroine, Julia, writes to her sister. "My dear Louisa, you will laugh when I tell you that poor Winifred, who was reduced to be my gentlewoman's gentlewoman, broke 2 laces in endeavouring to draw my new French stays close. You know I am naturally small at bottom, but now you might literally span me. You never saw such a doll. Then they are so intolerably wide across the breast that my arms are absolutely sore with them, and my sides so pinched. But it is the ton, and pride feels no pain. It is with these sentiments the ladies of the present age heal their wounds. To be admired is a sufficient balsam." This extract makes it clear that while stays were seen as indispensable, they could also be painful. And while the ladies of the English court were happy to make the sacrifice, their French equivalents weren't so willing. Marie-Antoinette, who was Georgiana Devonshire's contemporary, hated stays so much that, as a young girl, she utterly refused to wear them. Her mother, the Empress Marie-Therese of Austria, became so concerned about her daughter developing poor posture as a result of not wearing a corset that she commissioned several sets of special stays that had less rigid boning in order to try and coax the young princess into wearing them. Nevertheless, once she was the Queen of France and a leader of fashion in her own right, Marie-Antoinette pioneered a trend towards simpler dressing that was based on an idealized interpretation of a light muslin chemise or petticoat. Known as the chemise à la reine, the gown had soft, billowing lines, and it was tied with only a simple sash at the waist, which allowed the wearer to dress without the restriction of stays. It's interesting to note here that during the French Revolution, this preference for soft, unrestricted clothing was just one of the many excuses that Marie-Antoinette's enemies would use against her. There was an association encouraged in the collective public imagination between a woman's virtue and a woman's corset. Her tightly laced stays being seen as a sign of modesty, while unlaced stays, or worse still, no stays at all, were considered to be a token of debauchery and moral turpitude. So the Queen's preference for not wearing stays, and also for promoting a fashion for outerwear that was reminiscent of underwear, was used as a stick to beat her with by the revolutionary factions who were bent on her destruction. Nevertheless, after her execution in 1793, the trend for unrestricted dressing that Marie-Antoinette had pioneered was claimed by the new post-revolution queens of fashion as a symbol of liberty. The women of Napoleon's circle, such as Madame Récamier and Paulina Borghese, had their portraits painted in flowing chemise-style dresses that were supposed to symbolise the freedom of the new France, but which were ironically reminiscent of the gauzy, loose-fitting gowns that Marie-Antoinette had loved so much. This looser style of dressing, which featured a high waist and flowing lines, became known as Empire style after the Napoleonic Empire. And in spite of the wars that were going on at the time between France and Britain, it became equally fashionable on both sides of the Channel. Consequently, for a period of time at the beginning of the 19th century, stays suddenly fell completely out of fashion in both Paris and London. The tight-laced, wasp-waisted silhouette of the previous generation was now considered to be terribly outdated, and so while many women might still choose to wear stays to enhance their figures, they did so quietly, concealing their corsetry under a loose empire-line gown in order to present a more natural-looking figure to the world. Nor were they the only ones who were resorting to this subterfuge, because during the Regency era, many gentlemen also resorted to the corset in order to improve their figures and create the coveted Corinthian or Regency buck silhouette that was favoured by the dandies of the era. This style of dressing took the form of an inverted triangle and demanded wide shoulders and a broad chest, along with a tapering waist and a pair of muscular thighs, clad in tight breeches. It was a very masculine and very idealized look, and of course not every man in fashionable society was blessed with a body that could achieve it. So while we conventionally tend to think of women as the ones who would resort to figure-enhancing undergarments, this was a period when men, too, used all manner of secret underpinnings in order to cut a dashing figure. Skinny legs were judiciously padded, as were narrow shoulders, and corsets were used to pull in protruding stomachs and create a more svelte, tapering line. The Regency period produced some incredibly elegant silhouettes for both men and women, but by the 1830s, fashions were changing again. There was a new monarch on the British throne, Queen Victoria, and along with the new Victorian era, male and female silhouettes were once again beginning to transform. In fact, they were reverting. Attire for men became less body conscious, and for women, it became more so. Fashionable ladies once again returned to the wasp waists and full skirts that had been in fashion in the previous century, and with these changes, stays came back with a vengeance. At the same time, new technology was altering the way that corsets were made. Traditionally, they'd always been created by hand, but in 1832, a Swiss tailor named Jean Verly patented what he called a woven corset, which could be made seamlessly on a loom with slots for the boning and busk, which were added in later by hand. There were also advances in materials, with flexible spiral steel rods replacing baleen as the main stiffening agent. These innovations made corset manufacturing much cheaper, and corsets became far more popular and far more universally worn by women. As the century wore on, corset styles would occasionally change shape to reflect current fashions, sometimes with a greater emphasis on raising the bust line, and sometimes with more focus on padding out the hips. However, throughout all these changes, the corset remained a staple of fashion right up until the end of the 19th century. Consequently, when we look back now, the Victorian era is the period of history that is often most associated with the corset. And once again, its use reflected the general position of women in society, which, as the 19th century wore on, actually became increasingly restricted. Once again, a social parallel was drawn between a woman's corset and a woman's virtue, and it's worth noting that the phrase straight-laced, which is still used in Britain today to denote someone with very high morals, is thought to have its origin in the way a woman wore her corset. A very straight-laced corset was, of course, one that was severely pulled in and very tightly tied. And in an era when women's characters were increasingly portrayed in terms of extremes, either as the saintly angel of the house or as the sinful femme fatale, the more respectable a woman was, the more she was expected to remain rigidly laced into her corset. Just how rigid that lacing should be was often a matter of debate. Among the elite of society, the cult of the tiny waist led leaders of fashion to lace as tightly as possible, sometimes to the point where the wearers would faint. At the same time, tight lacing was also occasionally used as a punishment or as a threat to ward off supposedly lax feminine behavior. However, doctors were beginning to have their doubts about the healthiness of tight lacing. Medical journals were beginning to publish an increasing number of papers that argued against tight lacing and suggested that it could cause health issues, anything from heart palpitations and shortness of breath to displacement of the major organs. Some women agreed with the doctors, and some women protested against them, claiming that they actually felt better when they were laced tightly. And so the debate raged on and on, in both newspapers and journals, for several decades. To the modern mind, the term corset certainly still conjures up an image of an extremely tight-laced 19th century lady, and there's no doubt that some Victorian-era women did suffer physically as a result of tight lacing. However, in reality, I suspect the ultra-narrow waist of Victorian fashion plates was only worn by a very small number of women. For everyday wear, most ladies would have laced their corsets in a moderate way so that they could still move around easily. And contrary to popular opinion, corsets are fairly easy to get about in, unless they're laced extremely tightly. I myself have worn one on stage on a number of occasions. They make you think about the way you move your body and the way you carry yourself. However, it's a myth that they rendered the wearer immobile. And certainly, if you lace a corset in a moderate way, there are very few physical actions that you can't manage. Nevertheless, there's a big difference between wearing a corset for a couple of hours of performance every evening and being obliged to wear one day in, day out, simply in order to fit in with some restrictive notion of feminine respectability. So the fact that corsets held sway over women's bodies for so many decades during the 19th century tells us a lot about the sexual, social and political limitations that were placed on women during the Victorian era. By the early 20th century, things were finally beginning to change. Fashion was beginning to reflect the women's campaign for suffrage, and a looser, more natural silhouette began to emerge in the designs of couturiers such as Paul Poiret and Lucille. Then, with the advent of World War I, many societal and cultural norms were completely overturned, and the greater freedoms for women that resulted in the post-war years were reflected in the drop-waisted flapper fashions of the 1920s. As women's rights blossomed and grew, so the corset fell out of favour, and with the exception of a very brief and limited comeback in the 1950s, with the new look, corsetry remained gone for good, a relic of a restrictive, bygone era. Today, however, the corset still remains popular in various niches of culture and fashion. Fashion designers such as Vivienne Westwood and Jean-Paul Gaultier have resurrected and restyled the corset at various different times, and it's also become a favourite with members of countercultural style movements such as goth, punk and steampunk. Interestingly, in the 21st century, the role of the corset in fashion now appears to be precisely the opposite of what it once was. Rather than conveying a rigid morality and social repression, it's now become a byword for a more unorthodox sense of style and creative playfulness. And in this sense, I think the corset continues to reflect the way societal roles are changing. Stylistically speaking, the corset is also now a very diverse item of clothing. Whether you want to adorn yourself in a gorgeously embroidered 18th century style brocade corset, or pull in your waist with a shiny PVC fetish creation, there's a style to suit you and help you to express yourself. This also reflects current culture, I think. It tells us something about contemporary Western society because it mirrors a cultural willingness to embrace individuality, and so what was once a symbol of social limitation has now become a symbol of celebratory self-expression. Whether worn by a woman or a man, and whether sported on stage, in a club, or just in the privacy of the home, the continuing appropriation and adaptation of the corset tells us a lot, not just about fashion, but also about the endless creativity of the times and humanity's desire for reinvention and self-expression. This brings me to the end of my talk about the history of corsets, and I do hope you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating corner of fashion history with me. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.